Hello viewers, and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we are talking about another one of the original 13 colonies. I am talking about the Constitution state, Connecticut. Connecticut is a very innovative state. It was allegedly the state to have the first hamburger in 1895, as well as the first helicopter in 1939, and the first color TV in 1948. Also, fun fact, I learned another weird law coming from Connecticut, specifically in Hartford, the capital city. It is illegal to cross the street on your hands. So anyone trying to impress their friends with their coordination and balance by walking on your hands, do it indoors, far away from streets, and you'll thank me later. So today's video is actually going to be pretty short relative to my other ones because Connecticut is not having a senatorial election or a gubernatorial election this year. They're only having elections for House seats and, of course, the presidential election. So first, let's talk about Connecticut's House seats. Connecticut has 7 Electoral College votes and therefore 5 congressional districts. All 5 districts are currently represented by Democrats, and all 5 districts have partisan leans leaning into the Democratic column, according to the Cook Political Report's Partisan Voting Index. In fact, the only 2 districts that I would consider to be remotely competitive this year are Connecticut's 2nd and Connecticut's 5th district. And the only reason for that really is because their Cook PVI leans are respectively +3 into the Democratic column and +2 into the Democratic column, meaning that they're pretty close to being politically centrist. But when analyzing those 2 districts specifically even further, one would learn that they've both been represented by Democrats since 2007. In fact, Connecticut's 2nd has been represented by the same man since that year, Joe Courtney, and Connecticut's 5th has been represented by 3 separate Democrats over the last 13 years. To understand if these 2 relatively centrist districts have even a chance of flipping, we have to look at raw House turnout numbers from the state of Connecticut. Let's bring that graph up right now. Okay, yeah, looking at this seems like it bodes pretty well for Democrats running in the state. Looking specifically at the data points for 2012 and 2016, we see that gap widening in favor of Democrats. In fact, Democrats' worst performance over the last decade still had them ahead. That was, of course, in the year 2014 when Republicans really just cleaned up in Congress that year. Regardless, Connecticut still had very good Democratic performances running for House seats. So considering that we're months away from a presidential election cycle year, graph aside, I think I can say with confidence that none of Connecticut's 5 districts are likely to flip this year. Connecticut is an all-Democratic represented state at the House level, and it's going to remain that way at least for the next 2 years. So let's make that official and put it on our first map. Mark it. And now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Connecticut is a state that last voted for a Republican for president in 1988 when they elected George H.W. Bush over challenger Michael Dukakis. However, in more recent years, Democratic shares of the vote at the presidential level in Connecticut have not fallen below 54%. Since the 21st century began. So it would seem that Joe Biden is in a pretty good position to start with heading into this November. But let's look deeper into that. Let's pull up some voter turnout ratios to see how Connecticut voters elect presidents. Let's look at those right now. All right, and there they are. And wow, yeah, okay, so Republicans actually have a pretty noticeable advantage and enthusiasm in Connecticut. What these numbers basically mean is that over the past decade, the Democrat running for president has received fewer votes than the total of all House candidates, all Democratic House candidates running in the state that year. Whereas the Republican candidate for 2012 and 2016 received more votes than the total of Republican House candidates running that year. And this is true for both 2012 and 2016, leading me to believe that this will continue into 2020 as well, meaning that Trump will have basically an enthusiasm advantage relative to House candidates running in Connecticut. But remember, because these are relative to House turnout, and House turnout is just much better for Democrats in general in Connecticut, this advantage might ultimately not mean much. Let's toss those graphs aside and also consider the incumbent's approval rating in the state of Connecticut, in this case, President Trump. As of this video, his approval rating is at negative 31 points, which is a really, really terrible figure for him. Now, when we combine that figure with the turnout advantage for Democrats in the state at the House level, and also considering the better presidential to House voter ratios in favor of Republicans, let's figure out how this is going to end up. Poll bot, Biden or Trump? There we have our answer. It's not a huge surprise to me. Biden winning Connecticut by about 24.5% margin of the vote. This number is actually a bit higher than I expected. It's even better than Barack Obama's performance over Senator McCain in 2008 when I believe he ran away with 22% margin of the vote. This pretty amazing value of 24% that we're seeing here is likely because of a very, very unpopular incumbent Republican president. And as a result, many Democrats in Connecticut chomping at the bit to get him out of office as soon as possible. This margin of victory might be a bit high, but regardless, I can say with confidence that Joe Biden is going to win Connecticut's 7 electoral college votes, so let's make that official and put it on our presidential map. Mark it. So all the electoral results are in for the state of Connecticut, and they look good for Democrats. Let's talk briefly about the political future of the state. Let's bring up an old line graph and a new one and get into this. So first, looking at raw House turnout numbers over the past decade for both parties in Connecticut, we see positive slopes for both parties. Specifically, in the Democrats' case, you have a slope value of 39.5. What that means is in a given election year, on average, Democratic House candidates have received 39,500 more votes than the previous election cycle. Republicans in the state also have a pretty impressive figure of 20, meaning they've added 20,000 votes on average every 2 years for their candidates. But that's still just over half the amount that Democrats are adding to their votes. In other words, the state is still breaking in the direction of Democrats at the House level. Where Connecticut does get a little weird is in the presidential to House vote ratios. We see going back to the beginning of the decade a consistent advantage from Republicans. Mitt Romney in 2012 and then Donald Trump in 2016 performed better, basically received more votes than all of the Republicans running in the House in the state that year. Whereas Barack Obama in 2012 and then Hillary Clinton in 2016 received just fewer votes than the total of Democrats running in the House in Connecticut that year. Of course, both years the state broke for Democrats at the presidential level, so this advantage and enthusiasm, which is relative to House turnout, ultimately was not enough to secure victories for either Republican candidate running in the state. Now, if this margin remains pretty untouched in years to come, could this possibly mean that Republicans win the state of Connecticut in the near future? Well, that would depend on how Connecticut voters elect House candidates, and as we saw from the previous graph, they are still breaking in the direction of Democrats. So, graphs aside, I'll give you my ultimate consensus on Connecticut. It is a very Democratic state, becoming more Democrat for the time being. Depending on how this presidential election turns out this November, we could very possibly see some more competitive races at the House level in the state, specifically what I was talking about earlier, Connecticut's 2nd and 5th. But if Trump wins a second term this year, then I consider them to be even further out of reach for Republicans for at least the next 10 years. Connecticut is becoming more Democratic very slightly at the moment, and well, it may hit its inflection point in the next 4 to 8 years or so, perhaps. But don't count on it flipping this year, or maybe even in 4 years from now. And that just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I do update that account with which state I am covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, and thank you for voting. See you next time.